Soviet and Russian history in the history department here at CU Boulder, and I'm your moderator for today. For recording purposes, today is Thursday, April 10th, 2025. It's 1 p.m., and this is panel number 18143, titled Psychology of a Dictator. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want you to be sure that you get a chance to ask questions. Here is how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. For more information, you can find their full bios on the CWA website. Our first panelist is Natasha Lindstaedt, who is a professor of government at the University of Essex, where she specializes in authoritarian regimes, autocratization, failed states, and human security. Her recent books include Democracies and Authoritarian Regimes, Authoritarian Resurgence and Democratic Decay, Human Security in Disease and Disaster, and Research Handbook on Authoritarianism, where she served as co-editor. Our second panelist is Vicky Sama. Vicky Sama teaches courses in media law and ethics, sports media, and covering political campaigns. In 2022, she returned to her alma mater, the University of Colorado Boulder, after her tenure at Cal Poly Humboldt, where she was a professor of media law and journalism department chair. Matija Goljar is an entrepreneur and educator who started his first tech company as a college freshman and later founded one of the largest entrepreneurship education programs in Eastern Europe. He gained nationwide recognition in Slovenia for creating and hosting the reality TV show Started Up Slovenia, which followed young founders launching their products in a major supermarket chain.
Erin, don't make us blush.
So that's all for me, and now we're going to hear a little bit from Natasha.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So as Erin mentioned, my main area of research is the study of dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. And so for my contribution today, I'm going to be focusing only on personalist dictatorships. And this is a type of dictatorship where one person has amassed a considerable amount of power. Most power is concentrated in that person's hands. The military has been coup-proofed or deliberately weakened, deliberately deprofessionalized, so that there really isn't a threat coming from the military. So the military doesn't really have much power. The political party doesn't really have much power. It's been gutted of its ideological coherence, and it basically does whatever the dictator wants it to do. And so you also don't have a ruling family that's in power, like a monarchy like in Saudi Arabia. So personalist styles of dictatorships are on the rise. Personalism in general is on the rise. I plan on not mentioning Trump throughout. I'm just going to talk more about dictatorships and the psychology, and we can maybe connect the dots if you feel like it or not. So there are 5 different traits, psychological traits, that are most commonly associated with dictatorships. So the first one is this Machiavellianism, someone who is highly manipulative, who doesn't have much morality, lacks empathy. The second one is this psychopathy, that they are completely lacking in affect, lacking in remorse. The last three I'm going to focus on a little bit more detailed. The third one is narcissism, a delusional belief in their own abilities, delusions of grandeur. They alone can solve everything. They are so certain of their ability. They are very attention-seeking. They need attention at all times. They have an unrelenting quest for power. At the same time, something that's really interesting about narcissists is that they have feelings of inferiority, which brings me to the fourth one, which is paranoia. So the charismatic, paranoid narcissist dictator is a common combination of characteristics. And the paranoid, they trust no one, they rely on no one, they want to do everything themselves, they have a strong need for control. They will often reject evidence if it contradicts their pre-existing views, and they will get enraged when people try to reason with them. They'll respond with anger when confronted by reason, and they will even destroy their most loyal supporters. Saddam Hussein had said that he knew, even before his followers did, when they were going to betray him. They have high levels of suspicion, they're hypersensitive, and they are so fearful of losing power that this drives them to engage in policies of constant surveillance and repression. And then that brings me to the last one, which I already briefly mentioned, which is this charismatic aspect, that dictators often have high levels of charisma, that their followers grant them this special superhuman level of power or mystique, heroicism, omniscience, that they have this messianic types of qualities, and they tend to be these extroverted figures in some ways that when they're speaking to people have an ability to manipulate a public with ease and to get people to blindly follow what their ideas are. So as a result of these are like the most common characteristics that tend to characterize these personalist style dictatorships. And so if we look into some of the outcomes of this, as I mentioned, they want to do everything alone. They've got to do it alone. So if we look at Saddam Hussein, and I'll mention him a lot because he's a classical personalist dictatorship, he was in control of so many different aspects of the Iraqi government. He was not just the president, he was the prime minister. He was commander of their armed forces. He was the chairman of the Ba'ath Party. He was the chairman of their Revolutionary Council. He held a lot of positions. In Central African Republic, one of the leaders from the 60s and 70s who anointed himself Emperor Bokassa, he controlled so many different cabinets and ministries that when he left the country couldn't function. It would collapse because no one else knew how to do anything. The other really important aspect of dictatorships, drawing on these characteristics that I've already mentioned, is because they're so paranoid, they don't trust anyone and they don't want to surround themselves with those that have expertise or experience. They prefer to surround themselves with those who are loyal, who are sycophantic, and often who are completely incompetent. That makes them feel better. So if Idi Amin didn't have any formal education, he wanted to surround himself with those that didn't know anything. That could make him feel better about himself. So that cabinet meetings were not really a time to talk about policy. He found that boring. He just wanted to be around people who were telling him how great he was. And often what is the case with these personalist style dictatorships, because they're surrounded by basically idiots, they are horrible when it comes to military intelligence because they don't have quality military intelligence. They are told what they want to hear all day. So when Saddam Hussein was asking his generals that surrounded him, how well was the war going, the second war with the US, the second Persian Gulf War, they were telling him what he wanted to hear. They were engaging in all kinds of false reporting, which is one of the outcomes of these types of dictatorships. There is a plethora of just untrue reporting about what is happening. That no, we have the strongest tanks, we have the strongest weapons, even while the U.S. was encircling Saddam Hussein. Let's just look at Putin here with Russia. He coup-proofed his military. I mean, his military should be much, much stronger. They spent $100 billion on their military, and yet it is weak because he purged the most sophisticated, the most experienced, the strongest people within his own military. And within 1 year, 20 generals had died on the battlefield. They are performing much worse. The Russians are performing much, much worse than they should be. Gaddafi, another personalist dictatorship, surrounded himself by his family members, loyal people, those that were part of the same tribe. They invaded 6 out of 7 of their neighbors, and Libya lost. Libya lost in a conflict with Chad, one of the poorest regimes in the world. So there is example after example of how this poor intelligence, because they're not surrounding themselves with the best people, leads to these terrible outcomes for them. Not just on the battlefield, but they also are terrible performers in everything else when it comes to economic development and economic growth as well. They want to feel important. That's another aspect of this. And so they will issue some of the most banal instructions sometimes. Instructions that make no sense, like why is this person talking about this at the moment? Why did Gaddafi order every single person in Libya to own a chicken? We don't know. Why did he change the days of the week? Why did he change the calendar? So they're on a completely different calendar. We don't know. Why did the leader of Turkmenistan, who anointed himself Turkmenbashi, why did he ban newscasters from wearing makeup? Why did he ban ballet? Because he found it was dull. Why did he tell people that no one could smoke after he quit smoking? I mean, it is these sort of whimsical ideas that they're allowed to issue, and they will face no pushback. I want to focus on one last thing, and then I'll stop. Is that because they contain all of these different, often Machiavellian, psychopathic, sadistic characteristics, you see that they respond in so much anger when things don't go well. So I'll return to the case of Saddam Hussein, who in the Iraq-Iran war, which he initiated, and he made this decision in isolation. He never would consult anyone when he would decide to do anything. By 1982, the war was going very poorly. They were losing lots of men, and he himself was probably thinking they needed to have some kind of stalemate. The Ministry of Health suggested, Saddam, why don't you temporarily step down and then we'll negotiate some kind of end to the conflict because the Iranians don't want you in power, and that's the one way we can negotiate the end of the conflict. And Saddam thanked him for his suggestion. And then the next day, this man's body was chopped up, delivered to his wife in a body bag, duffel bag, excuse me. So there is an intense reaction to anything that contradicts them. And over time, it gets worse. Their support group will narrow. It becomes smaller and smaller. And their exits are always violent and protracted. And they will cling to power until the bitter end. Thank you.
Before I start talking about this topic, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Summit Middle School 8th grade English class who is joining us today.
Nice.
The students at the school are reading Anne Frank, and so they felt it was a great opportunity to attend the Conference on World Affairs today, and especially on this topic of dictators, since they are reading about Hitler and the Nazi Party. So welcome. Thank you for being here. Yeah.
And I'm going to interrupt you really quickly to say that if the audience, if you can scoot together, right, move towards the center to make room for others so people can grab seats at the ends, because we still have some folks standing in the back. Right.
Yes, there's seats up front. As I always tell my students, there's always going to be seats up in the front. So those of you who are standing in the back, if you want a seat, come on up front. So I am Vicky Sama. I am a journalism professor at CU Boulder here, and I teach media law and ethics and reporting classes, among other classes. I'm a former journalist who covered wars and politics and some other conflicts in South and Central America. So I am a little bit familiar with the journalistic experience and also on the media side of analyzing and taking a look at media coverage of the current situation we're in, especially with the new administration of Donald Trump, who's only been in office 80 days, I think, as of today. So we will be talking about that for sure. When we think about dictators, we think about names like Attila the Hun, Khrushchev, Pinochet, Marcos, al-Qaddafi, al-Assad. These are the names that we have been very familiar with as far as when we think of the term dictator and what that means. And I am not someone who has studied dictatorships like Natasha. She's extremely well-versed in the history of dictators and the differences between dictatorships and authoritarianism and tyranny and all of that, but there's a lot of crossover. But what's really interesting to me is to watch as we are now reading a lot of political commentary about our current US administration and the terms being used to describe Donald Trump in what appears to be something like a dictatorship. A year ago, when Donald Trump was still campaigning for office, he had said, "I intend to be a dictator," at least on day one. And he has proven himself true to that promise, and then some. So is it fair to call him a dictator? Is it accurate to call him a dictator? And that's one of the questions I'm thinking of when I'm talking to you today. And one of those, I don't know what the exact answer is, but from what I'm seeing and from what I'm learning as we're having these conversations about dictatorship, is that a dictator is someone who rules without any approval or consultation from anyone for their decision-making. So there's an extreme amount of power in one individual, and that individual does not have to seek a congressional approval or approval of the Supreme Court or the approval of another branch of government. We do have a Congress in this country. We do have a Supreme Court in this country, but we are seeing a weakening of the effect and of the use of the balance of power. And so I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this panel is power. And what we see as I've heard the term bald power grab. I don't know why it's called bald, but I would say it's definitely some kind of a power grab by the Trump administration to try to have more control under the guise of saving Americans money. And so I think, we laugh a little bit about things, but at the same time, I think we really need to evaluate whether or not that is the true purpose, right? Or what we are seeing is really something else. The conversations that are happening at the White House and in the administration about a third term for presidency, which we know the Constitution talks about a two-term limit for a president of the United States. That conversation is kind of curious. Where does that come from and why? Why is someone so concerned with serving a third term at the White House when they're just starting their second? So these are conversations I think that we need to have, and I'm sure this is probably on the tips of a lot of your tongues and minds today as we talk about dictatorships. So I'm going to leave it at that and let Matija chime in.
Thank you, professors. I'm always a little bit humbled to speak after people who are, well, at least academically, much more experts than I am myself. I would like to start with an observation that I see an absolutely completely packed house here at CWA, which is both a good and a bad thing, right? Considering the topic we are discussing at this point. I don't know what to say. I would love to make jokes like I did at all the other panels, but I'm reminded that in my hometown, it's a small village, and if you go basically over the hill through the forest and walk for about, I don't know, 2 hours, you get to this glade. And it's a beautiful part of the world, Slovenia, by the way, middle of nowhere. You'll never find it on a map. And in that glade, if you come on a nice day, you see exactly 100 apple trees blooming. Now, I'm telling this story because during World War II, in the times where the country was occupied, there was somebody living near that glade who basically informed on a battalion of the Nazi Wehrmacht. They betrayed their location to the partisans, who ended up making a successful ambush and basically, winning that particular battle. 10 Nazi soldiers died. And in retaliation, the Nazi Wehrmacht searched through the entire area. First, a place with exactly 100 trees. And then, exactly 100 children. And on every tree, a child was hung in retribution. I'm opening with this sad story because when I'm thinking about dictatorship, that is exactly what happens. When you go too far, when you strike too hard, the end result of a psychology of a dictator inevitably is escalation, counter-escalation, counter-escalation, and just like in a schoolyard fight, somebody gets hurt. But unlike a schoolyard fight, the consequences can be world-changing. Sometimes they can be irreparable. History teaches us, and we know that, particularly coming from our part of the world. And I am not an expert on the political science. I will never be able to tell you what precisely is that tipping point where somebody becomes a dictator. But I would argue humbly from somebody who basically heard these types of stories, and there were many of them, on a daily basis, for years, for generations even. The definition does not matter. Because the end result of every escalation is always the same. We know that, right? So what's the message here? When we see somebody with the tendency of all the fine points that Professor Natasha mentioned, and I saw the audience sniggering at, ooh, was he this? Was he that? Was he that? Right? I think the reaction should be not discussion whether he did go too far at this particular point in time, but to notice the trend and to do something about it and to stop it before it becomes too worse. Now, there's so many things we can open up at this panel, and I understand why it is a packed house. I don't know, for me, humbly, when habeas corpus doesn't work, where somebody is extrajudicially closed, detained, and exported, expelled, I don't know, maybe that's when we've gone too far. There's a story that I am sure that the middle school class would be able to recite because probably the teacher is testing them on it. What was that Hannah Arendt quote? First they came for my neighbors, then they came for the Jews, then they came for these, then they came from those, and when I was the only one left, nobody could speak up. My dear friends, you here, particularly in this town, in this institution, even though the whole country may be fighting and even though you all might be in a position where I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Certainly we had a discussion just before, what are the things that we can say because there are cameras and somebody, retribution might happen. But maybe now is the time for you collectively to think, what can you do? And we collectively can think, what can we do? For my part, I know I need to speak up. That's why I'm here at this panel. For you guys, I'm sure there's a ton of things that you personally can do. It's not only about the protest, and it's not only about being loud and writing articles. Maybe it's just small things. Being kind to one another. Recognize where somebody is making a fascist, bigoted remark, speaking up. Maybe it can be just that. Thank you, Professor, for bringing the class. Maybe it's just about teaching the young generation that they are aware of history and they can do better. Times are difficult. I admit I am afraid. But it does not mean that I have to lose hope. So remember, and I'll conclude with this, that this event that is happening here, with all its eclectic speakers and all its weird quirks and discussions that we're doing, I know this when it comes to the psychology of a dictator. Every dictator would hate us. So I am acknowledging that this event happened once again for the 77th time. And I expect and believe that it will happen for the 100th time and for the 200th time and for many years in the future. Let's keep going.
Okay, thank you, Natasha, Vicky, and Matija for those comments. And now we have plenty of time for Q&A, which is great. We do prioritize student questions, so we're gonna start out with a couple of student questions. First question, is there a correlation between the modern CEO and authoritarians? Who wants to take that one?
I guess I'm the only one from the business world, and I'm
Yeah,
gonna tell you,
Matija,
well, kinda, yes. No, but here's the thing. My mother owns a tiny accounting company. It's like 15 people. It's pocket-sized, you know? And I promise you, my mom is a really good person. But when she was discussing with me how leadership in business works, I quote her, and I'll explain why. A CEO is not a diplomat, but a dictator. Why? Because when you execute what needs to happen, when you give day-to-day orders, it needs to work, it needs to happen. So in that context, I understand where this question comes from. Yes, of course, you need to be a little bit more direct and expect a result. But my point here is this. If you combine directness with humility and with restraint, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. A CEO or a politician, in my humble opinion, becomes a dictator precisely at the point where it is no longer about the people who elected him or her, but about his goals or her goals or his expectations or whatever that pursuit happens. Was it Machiavelli who said that the ends justify the means or something like that? I don't know, the professor will say more. I will just add to this. It is too simplistic just to say, ooh, all big CEOs are kleptomaniacs and dictators, and there is a trend in this country that people go too far. Yeah, maybe you guys are a bit less, we have a bit less solidarity, but I don't believe for a second that Americans have lost kindness, right? Only some people in some particular party with some particular redheads have maybe gone a bit too far.
No, I would just add really quickly, I mean, I see more of a connection between more like a mafia don and a dictatorship. Some, rich billionaires rise to power. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to rule in a dictatorial manner. But those with sort of mafia-like behaviors, those are the ones to watch out for.
I think what the question really leads to for me is the question about money and power, right? This is when I said we were going to be talking about power. And I think that with anyone who has immense amounts of power, those could be people in corporations, people in government, people in institutions of higher education, religious institutions, right? These are people who are very powerful. And I think that there is a real importance and a role for journalism to make sure that it can keep those people in power in check and to report when people in power exploit that power. I think that is really kind of a solution to the power grab and making sure that we have the fourth estate and that we support our journalism that is doing that kind of work, because I think that's where a lot of the solutions will happen. Of course, we've seen in the last month the White House kicking out journalists from the White House press room. The Associated Press reporters were kicked out for a while. I think it was just a few days ago, maybe it was yesterday, that they were told that they would be allowed back into the White House press room to cover the president and the presidency, which is important for a wire service company, which is an international company. A lot of other news agencies rely on the news that come out of the Associated Press. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to providing the free press with information that it needs and access that it needs to be able to report and to cover those in power. So it's not as easy to actually cover people in corporations as it is to cover politicians, because we have a First Amendment, and that First Amendment allows the press access to certain things happening in government, like it allows the press access to government documents, except if things fall in certain exceptions like national security. It allows the press access to the president to be able to talk in a press room. We don't have that same kind of right when it comes to the private sector. So there's no constitutional right for the press to oversee corporations and to look into the books of corporations. The Security and Exchange Commission is obviously the agency that is tasked with that job, and the journalists can look to the SEC to try to get that information, but to go to a corporate boss and say, okay, we want to look at your records and to see, that doesn't happen. So corporations, and I think this is a pretty interesting question from the student, CEOs and dictatorships and that sort of relationship that the student is putting together there with that question, does raise the question about that power, the power that someone who heads a corporation has, and is that something we need to be concerned about? Is there, so can we kind of make that relationship, or can we draw that kind of connection? And I could see where they're coming from when they're thinking that. And that comes down to that power, that issue of power, who has the power, how they're using the power, and how those who have the ability can keep that power in check.
Thank you. Another question from a student. How do we empower people to prevent power concentration in the hands of a dictator in the digital age? And this person adds they're concerned about AI-driven misinformation.
I think that's one of the biggest problems facing democracies today, is that we were having a conversation about this with some students earlier, that we have two sets of facts. We used to all get the same news. Maybe the news differed a little bit. Maybe we interpreted the news a little bit differently, but we have one set of facts and then another alternative set of facts, to quote Kellyanne Conway. And that makes it really difficult to have a conversation. And dictators thrive on dividing us. One of the strategies in Russia is to flood the citizens with so much information, so much propaganda, that they're confused, divided, apathetic, and by disabling people, and where people don't have the understanding of what the facts are, that makes it difficult for the opposition to be united, to work together, to work collectively, and instead we're sort of getting, distracted by all these issues. I know that there's work being done to try to correct the misinformation problems that we're dealing with. And I think this is a really serious and valid concern, and something that we have to continue to work on, because it's really hard to have a democracy where people don't have access to the truth, and then there's separate types of truth. But it's a growing area is studying AI, the impact that it has on democracy, and trying to understand ways in which we can combat misinformation.
Listen, I have a lot of empathy for somebody who is in a position that they, he, she believe that they're disenfranchised. I understand living in the middle of nowhere in the Rust Belt, where you're basically making ends meet and have no hopes about the future. Of course you're going to be upset with the status quo. I understand completely also, not that I condone it, that there is always, throughout human history, going to be a political force who will want to take advantage of that discomfort to their advantage so that they can vote, that they can get them to vote, so that they can basically skew the truth in such a way that they take power. I have no problem with the question that there should be political discourse. Believe me, I'm coming from Europe, I'm a bigger lefty than you guys, and I know that we've had panelists who've been completely right-wing and we've had shouting matches, and that is fine. Only one thing should never be discussed: the right to have the discussion, the right to have these conversations, and the human dignity and decency that you do not go too far and act directly against somebody, to beat them down, to pick specific segments of the society, whether they're from this country, whether they're this gender, whether they're something else entirely. That is where we have a problem. And now concretely to the point of disinformation. We all know that, right? We all hate it. We all notice when somebody is lying. I think the first step is to overreact when that happens and not wait too late. Very simply. And if I may add just this, humans are super bad at reacting quickly where some process happens gradually. Often than not, what ends up happening is that there is an egregious situation, and then you can latch onto that and use it as an example. In your history, unfortunately, there is this famous story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till. When that happened, when that was a situation occurring, that was the catalyst. A more recent example might be in my neighboring Serbia, which has huge student protests right now. And the catalyst there was that after years and years of a dictatorial, kleptomaniac regime, there was a construction project at a railroad in a small town. And because there was corruption, they were cheap when they were building the roof fell down, 14 people got killed. And after that, when that was happening, that mobilized the students to stand there. And every day they would stand silent for 14 minutes in the memory of people killed. The government overreacted. The dictator overreacted and was like, you're against me and this is a problem. And what happens then? The protesters escalated. And they opened this discussion that the small-scale situation there was an example of a far wider problem of corruption and of cronyism. Let me tell you, if you look it up, 2 weeks ago, over 1 million people in a country of 9 million was in the capital city, peacefully demanding a change of government. And they're coming back and doing it again, and they're doing all kinds of civic interventions. But they will not stop, and they have patience. Civic action does work, and it will work if you are smart about it, and when you simply see an egregious case where somebody's beliefs or rights or truths are trampled, that you stand up. And you still have that power within you. I am sure of it.
I want to address the student's question in two parts. The student raised the concept in the question here about how do we prevent power concentration into the hands of a dictator, or I'm assuming you mean anyone really, in the digital age that we're living in. And I want to first address that part of the question, and then something that Matija said, I wanted to follow up on that. Donald Trump was very successful in bypassing the media in his first campaign, in using social media to go directly to audiences and directly to the public with information. Without the filter of journalists to verify information, it was very easy to allow propaganda, even if it's misinformation, right? Information that it might be true, it might be exaggerated, it might be false, who knows? Kind of that attitude was the initial attitude, and a lot of people laughed about it. A lot of people wrote it off and said, oh, he's a joke, he's never going to get elected president, we can't take him seriously. But that was extremely effective. He used the social media very effectively to be able to get a message out that he would not have otherwise been able to get out with someone who was a journalist who would have verified facts before reporting it. So social media has made it a lot more difficult for us to verify information or to know what is true or what is not true. And I will say, a lot of what Donald Trump says is not false, but sometimes it's exaggerated, or sometimes it is an outright lie. Sometimes we don't know if it was intentional disinformation or perhaps just accidental misinformation. And that becomes a problem because there's nobody filtering, vetting, or editing the content. It just gets out there. And we, as the American public, scoop it up. We eat it up. We consume it. It's very, very easy to let democracy go. Having democracy takes work. If we think about the framers of the Constitution, who in the initial days of this country decided that they no longer wanted to live under the power of a king, of a kingdom that would approve anything that got published before anyone saw it. You had to have the stamp of the King of England before you could publish a document in this land, which was not yet the United States. So the framers knew that. And when they wrote the Constitution, they made sure that they not only gave people the right to speak and to protest and to grieve against government decisions, that they also made sure that they put something in there that was really special and unique. The protection of the press. Without a free press, we do not have a free people. Look at countries around the world that do not have a free press. They are stuck. If you look at China, North Korea, Syria, I can name tons of them, right? We've seen democracies fall. We have seen people who have felt powerless and unable to respond. And I think what Matija had said was really, really important, that people are very hesitant to respond to things that happen gradually rather than things that happen so quickly, which is kind of ironic because Donald Trump's only been in office 80 days. And you could say that's been slow, right? But in those 80 days, there's been a lot that's been done. And let me name some of those things. He's fired independent inspectors generals across about 18 federal agencies, including the Federal Election Commission. And Ellen Weintraub, I think you're in the room right now. She's just been let go from the FEC. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right, which protects average Americans from corporate, and bank discrimination and problems that we might have. So at a very local sort of personal level, we can see how some of these decisions are not really going to be helpful in our democracy. That is to centralize power. That's all been to centralize power. There's definitely been an attempt to control independent agencies like the Security and Exchange Commission and the Federal Communications Commission. So in just these 80 days, I mean, this is a very small piece of what actions we have seen with the Trump administration, which have been clearly looking like a centralization of power. And so that question the student asked was very intuitive, very smart of you, to be seeing that, to be recognizing that there is something happening. There is something definitely happening where we're seeing a centralization of power at the executive branch and a weakening of power and checks and balances anywhere else. A weakening of our Congress, a weakening of our Supreme Court, a weakening of our press, because everything is being attacked. And this is where what Matija is saying is important, to really be aware of this. I don't know what the answer is and what to do, but we certainly need to be paying attention.
Oh, I know exactly what the answer is here with this one. And it's actually super simple. Now, don't clap before I tell it. But here's the thing. What's happening here in America influences the rest of the world because you are the biggest and the best and the only superpower left. What happens locally with us is that after Donald the Great does his stupid thing, there are a couple of little wannabe dictators repeating the same shit. Sorry, I'm cursing now. Is that okay? Okay. But here's my point. There is everything already known about that individual. There is everything known about all the political supporters of him. Midterms are coming up. Vote them out, right? I know that I am not in a position that I can influence who you're gonna vote for, and nor should I, but I will say this. It does not matter who is on the ballot against a fascist, because it is always better than the alternative. And it's super sorry when you're voting for somebody just because there is nobody better. But tough luck, this is the time we live in. And if, for the short term, this means that we will eat up the stupid alternative, whatever that alternative might be, it needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. As long as elections are held, the responsibility and the moral obligation of everyone is, we can agree on everything except on fascism. And you should tell everyone around you, and you should do everything so that we don't have this conversation again 4 years from now, and I don't know what happens next. So please vote and get those fascist idiots out.
Can I just follow up on that? I know that we don't have a conservative perspective on the panel, so I just want to try to bring a little bit of that in. You know, just in readings and conversations, these things are also being, you know, I hear and I read about the responses to the criticisms of Donald Trump and the criticisms of, you know, these kinds of actions and the executive orders. And a lot of the times the response has been, this is the best for America financially, and right? And so this is, you know, the plan 2025, was to take a centralized power in order to make change that couldn't happen without it. And that the change we're feeling is painful, but that it's for the benefit of all. Right? I'm just presenting this position. I'm not saying that I support it one way or another, right? But this is the other perspective.
Yeah, but Vicky, respectfully, I have to disagree with the premise of this. This is not a discussion liberal versus conservative or social democratic against libertarian. This is about fascism and everything else. And I don't have a problem with people being of whatever political persuasion, just as long as they don't deport people without any legal system behind it, thinking that somebody who is, I don't know, of one particular gender is not okay, thinking that somebody does not have rights because they have a different religion, and so on and so forth. And if you're asking me, is that going to have an influence on the economy and how much money this country has? Just picture this. Mental exercise. This university is a research university, and many others exist out there. Imagine if in this room alone there is one informer who is going to tell whoever is somewhere out there in Washington which professors like Donald and which professors don't. Yeah? Because that's exactly what's been happening in the 60s and the 70s in my part of the world. And you all know who won the Cold War, and you all know who won the economic fight. My guess is that a lot of your success is because you had a free society where the other side of the ocean did not. And you were able to explore any kind of weird ideas so that innovation could happen. Yes, short term for sure, putting tariffs of everything on the planet, including the penguins, is gonna make you richer. Long term though, you guys are gonna be screwed.
Okay, it's been a lively conversation. We've got a question, I think for Natasha, from one of our middle school students. You were talking about the psychology of dictators. Are there any dictators that have turned their lives around? Or is there no going back?
That is such a good question. Normally the trajectory is it just gets worse over time because they're surrounded by people that have learned that they really have to say the right things. They have to be delicate. They have to tiptoe. They have to fawn over the dictator. And they'll tell them, oh, this idea, you want to do this. Oh, that's amazing. You want to do this. That's amazing. And over time, that little loyal following becomes so narrow that the dictator is completely divorced from reality. So at the end of Gaddafi's leadership or tenure, he just couldn't see himself not being the leader of Libya eternally. You know, he wanted to fight until the bitter end. So it really is only these authoritarian light dictatorships where and this doesn't happen that often, but they step down from power, and they may find a new role as some sort of elder statesman. So I'm not going to use the term dictator here, but there were leaders that were authoritarian. I'll give you the example in Tanzania, Julius Nyerere. He was an authoritarian leader, but he really did care about Tanzania. He eventually did step down from power, and then he became an elder statesman in regional African politics. Same with Kwame Nkrumah. He was an authoritarian leader. He stepped down from power in Ghana, and then he became more involved, and also Obasanjo of Nigeria. But they really are not coming from personalist-style dictatorships. These are single-party authoritarian regimes where they have a lot of checks on their own leadership. They haven't really personalized power. They're not delusional. They don't exhibit those traits that I mentioned. And they do find a life afterwards that is compatible with them, where they can influence things still, but they don't have to do it in such a dictatorial manner.
Thank you. I have another student question. I think it's a really good one. How do institutional weaknesses or societal crises, on the one hand, then interact with the psychological profile of a leader to then produce an authoritarian regime? So then the question is psychology the spark leading to this authoritarian regime, or is it simply the fuel? Are there deeper issues behind this?
So typically, for a dictatorship to emerge, there has to be some decay of the institutions, that they can take advantage of parties that have weakened over time, where maybe the military has become less professionalized over time. Maybe people are filled with angst and frustration. They feel alienated. They feel like democracy isn't working for them. They feel really open to authoritarian alternatives. And if a certain type of leader emerges, a charismatic, paranoid, narcissistic style leader emerges in this kind of atmosphere, they can take advantage of these vulnerabilities and systematically go after the institutions and manipulate the public to rise to power and convince that public, as I already mentioned, that they need them, that this is a messianic type of person, that they are there to solve all of their problems, and they do take advantage of people in a crisis. And if there isn't a crisis, they'll manufacture the crisis. And they'll say, no, we're doing terrible, this is the worst that it's ever been, and you need me, and I alone am going to solve it for you. So they do take advantage of these kinds of atmosphere.
Now we have a question for Matija, also from a middle school student. Many people are scared to speak up because of the current administration. What advice do you have for them, specifically for young people? And thank you for being here.
Makes me super happy. I wish this would be an easier answer than to just vote the idiots out. But considering it's middle school, let me flip it around and say, what do you do when you see a bully? Right? I was bullied my whole life, just simply because, I was young, I was clumsy, I was geeky, all the things that, aren't really popular in high school. For me, well, I don't know how to say it politely. For me, at some point, you need to stand ground and fight back. And when people notice that you cannot be pushed around, then others will follow. The real issue here is not you yourself being afraid. In my opinion, and this goes not just in middle school, but across politics, when we as a society collectively believe that we should remain quiet, that's when the real damage happens. And that's also the story of socialist societies back on my side of the world. They were not super effective in governing. They were only making them sure that people were afraid to express their opinion freely and publicly. So then the idea was that what you believe is a minority opinion, and that the way you act, you're not going to have backing from others around you, and that's why you will be reluctant to act. I again bring up the example. Imagine for a second that among 200 people here in this room, there is one informer of an association organization like the Gestapo back in the day, or the Stasi, if you want to go on the other side of the political spectrum. Usually that's enough. Usually that's also why a dictatorship, when it's in place, is so entrenched and so strong. That's why the best result, the best outcome, is to speak up immediately. And when you see an injustice, you quickly do something about it. And to bring it back together, to answer your question, Michelle Obama said, when they go low, you go high. In a sense, I agree with that. It's a beautiful sentiment. But I'm also saying you can both go high and show that you have the guts to do something about it. And that's the real message I want to have for all of you here today. Now is the time that it is not only the red-hatted idiots who are doing brave and loud things. I'm kind of hoping a little bit for a lefty radical that's going to be at least loud. Certainly not anything super illegal and terroristic. Don't blow stuff up. But if you're going to do a weird demo, I'm all for it. And let me just, one final anecdote, and then we can go to the other questions. When I was about this big, we were protesting against, a minister for military and arms in my country who wanted to buy 300 tanks. We didn't like that because we were like, naive liberals, whatever. So 300 of us students decided that we would take our pocket money and we would go to the toy store, and every one of us would buy something like 100 plastic little toy soldiers. We showed up at the ministry, waited until he came to talk to us, and we gave them a toy soldier army so he could play with the army and not spend the money. Right? Find weird, quirky ways that you're going to be noticed, and you guys, students, are in a far better position than all of the other old fucks. Sorry. Because you know why? When you do it, people are going to laugh and they're going to find it funny. When somebody here else is going to do it, they might end up getting really beaten up or losing a job. So please, on behalf of the older generation, be a little bit more radical. I give you permission.
Okay, we've got another good question. Can a personalist-type dictator seize power when half of the populace is against him?
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. They can, because they can manipulate the institutions in ways that helps them sustain themselves in power without having a majority of support. There may have been a time period where they did have a majority of support, or they had genuine support, but they find ways that unlevel the playing field, whether they get control over the media so that they are controlling what information people are consuming, and there's really very little oppositional information out there. They get control of the party. They divide and conquer the opposition parties. They undermine the rule of law by weakening the judiciary, stuffing it with judges that are going to support their worldview or whatever their view is, or is basically a court that's their personal court. Often, dictators are actually elected, and then they slowly, gradually control things and they have to, because they start to lose support. I mean, in this case, I just want to give the example of Hungary, though. I think that, Viktor Orban calls it the two-thirds revolution, that he had two-thirds of support. But he gerrymandered the districts, and he's gerrymandered them to the point that he has an extra 20 to 25% of the seats, and he's not as popular as he wants people to think he is. He controls all the media. he or his cronies, they control all the media. There's very little oppositional media in Hungary. And he packed the courts with judges that are amenable to him. So he wants people to believe that he's super popular, and he says these kind of things over and over again, how popular he is and how much everybody loves him. But it's not the case. He just unleveled the playing field.
When you want to control what people do, you oppress them somehow, right? That's how you take away their rights, you take away their free press, you take away their access to information, and that is how you control what people do. And the people have to be educated to understand the power of people, the power of groups, the power of banding together and making collective action. And I think that is part of what is important in democracy, that we have that ability, that we can do that. When unions start to break up or broken up, and when we stop thinking about our differences, I think we will become stronger. Instead, thinking about what brings people together. I have lots of people in my life who are not politically in the same world as me, or they do not agree with my politics and I don't agree with their politics. And we find ways to find connections that we agree with, and that is something that we need to start thinking about as a collective. Matija, you mentioned at the beginning being kind to people, as showing that kindness, and I think that is what will allow us to be able to have conversations and be able to talk with people who are different, because it is very hard to reason with someone who has a very strong cognitive dissonance, and we all have it. We all have bias, we all include that, but when someone has a cognitive dissonance that's so deep-seated, that their beliefs are so strong that they are right, it is very hard to reason. And if we are constantly dividing ourselves from others who differ in what we think, there's gonna be no place for that conversation. And so this kind of atmosphere would allow a dictatorship to thrive. And so it's really important to be reaching across to people who you know and not separate from them, even though they may disagree politically. Because maintaining that that connection on the community level as a collective will only make democracy thrive. Otherwise, dictatorship will be inevitable.
Okay. Looks like we've got time for about one more question, and thanks to all of you who wrote questions. We had more than we could get to, so apologies for those people whose questions couldn't be asked. We have a question from someone who's concerned about the threat of dictatorship in the U.S., writing, elections are 2 years away, what can we do now?
Do you want me to start? I'll keep it brief, because I think I've already said some things about this. I mean, definitely. So I've been studying resistance to dictatorships more recently, and it's really important, as Matija has said, to vote. Parties that boycott elections, that doesn't really work. We have to participate. We have to pay attention to improve and strengthen our voting rights, which unfortunately have been deteriorating in many states that have been making it more difficult to vote, and there's all kinds of examples of voter suppression going on. I want to go back to the gerrymandering. That really worries me, because I'm worried that that's going to get worse over time, and then that will enable Trump to consolidate power. Various forms of protest are also important. So in my study of resistance, it really has to be everything all at once, a role for lawyers to play, for judges, and 57% of the judges were appointed by Democrats, but there were also more judges appointed by Reagan and Bush, and those judges thus far have been pushing back against Trump as well. Judges play an important role, civil society plays an incredibly important role, but just to echo what Matija and Vicky have been saying, it's incredibly important to not be apathetic.
Social media is playing a huge role in our lives today, and I think it's really important not to get caught up in the cacophony of messages. There's just so much out there. The chaos is strategic. That's to distract from the important things that are happening. And maybe, you know, the majority of people in the audience here are not stuck on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook every day, every hour of the day, or maybe you are. But either way, I mean, you need to support your local journalism and good journalists who are doing the work. It's really hard work. Journalists need the support of the public when they're attacked. It's really, usually the people who have the most critical voices are usually the loudest. And if you've ever been criticized by someone, you could get 1,000 compliments, but the person who criticized you, that one's the one that hurts, and that's the one you remember. It's the same thing as being a journalist today. You know, there's so much more of it. And so I think it's important to support good journalism that does good work and really vary your sources. People ask me all the time, well, what should I read, or what do you read? And I say, I read a lot. I don't have a television. I haven't had a television in 30 years. I don't watch TV. I'm not a member of Amazon Prime. I don't succumb to my cell phone at every will. And I think it takes a lot of work. It's work. So I think if, you know, you say, well, there's nothing I can do, there's a lot you can do. And I think that's part of it. And I will say, you know, one of the famous quotes from John Adams was, "We are a country of laws, not of men." And that's a really important quote from one of our founding fathers. And I think there is a reason that we have laws in this country. There's a reason we have a constitution. And we must protect the Constitution. And we must not make propaganda redefine the Constitution. And that is where journalism comes in. Without a free press, you do not have a free people.
Mm-hmm. I'm super scared of this question because I don't think I have a good enough answer, and I really want a good enough answer. At the same time, maybe this is a little bit of a joke, but I'm a little afraid if I'm going to be invited back after the tapes are going to be examined by ICE, and I don't know. Now, here's the thing. Psychologically, the easiest way for a bully to win is to instill fear. Psychologically, the easiest way for a dictator to win is to take away hope. And this past 2 weeks visiting America yet again and being, you know, blessed by your hospitality here, I have seen much more fear than ever before. Much more loss of hope and faith that things can get better. And this is how those guys win. Don't forget that even though at this conference here, the conservatives will say, we won a majority. They did not. They got a plurality, and the majority is still somewhere else, sadly at home, when they elect. But let me tell you this. Majority or no majority, politics or not, I have one simple belief, a faith, if you might call it, even though I was born from a world where atheism apparently is the big thing, and you know what's my faith? Nobody was born wanting to be a bad person. Nobody was born wanting to be a Nazi. I think the majority will always be on our side. The real question is, what are we going to do? When they are going to be shouting at us, when they are going to be telling us that we should not matter, that we should give up, ignore the institutions because the status quo is shit. I think the best answer I can give to that is a story that I heard first on this campus by a local professor when I was a kid, basically trying to figure things out for myself. And he said the following. One day, a father and a son were walking down the street, and they decided to go into the forest to have some fun together. And, the little kid, super curious, super excited about everything, was asking the father, what's this? What's that? Can I play with this? Can I touch that? You know how kids are. The dad was super nice, and he was always encouraging the little child to explore his environment. So the father and the son walk up to this huge log. The log is bigger than the kid. And the kid looks up to his dad and says, Daddy, can I move the log? And the father says, of course, if you use all your strength, you can move the log. Try. So the little kid does, tries to lift up the log. It's bigger than him. Of course, he fails. Looks up at the father. Daddy, why are you giving me false hope? And the father responds, my beloved son, I told you if you use all your strength, you can move the log. Your biggest strength is not in you and your muscles and in your hands, but in those around you, in asking for help. Us together, we can move the log. And please remember this. We alone can do a lot, but together, we can do everything. Thank you, CWA.
I want to thank all the panelists, Natasha, Vicky, and Matija, and also the Conference on World Affairs and the organizers for inviting us to be here. Thank you, and I hope the rest of you have a great day.